Hey everybody! In this video, I am going to be going over the essay titled The Figurative Ideal by Penelope Curtis. In the essay, Curtis essentially examines how the treatment of the figure, the figurative ideal, in modern sculpture shifted from a formal to symbolic representation. For clarification, I will read directly from the essay, one of the very first paragraphs where Curtis details her thesis statement. And she says, quote, "I propose in this chapter more particularly to look at the figure as an ideal in itself, an ideal which represented a possible answer for sculptors, and as a solution that moved from being primarily formal to being primarily symbolic." I think before we begin that something really important to note at the top of this video is that this essay was written in 1999, and it's a reflection on a period of sculpture that Curtis, the author, thinks is already somewhat detached from the contemporary viewer. She suggests early on that much of the need for this solution of the figure as symbol was a response to the political landscape of the world when these works were created. She writes that during this time, there was a rise in nationalism for many European countries as a result of having experienced 2 world wars during a single generation. And she finds that by the time she's writing this piece in 1999, the awareness of the contemporary viewer to the significance of this shift to symbolism has already significantly decreased. She basically suggests that this is much less obvious to us now looking at these sculptures, and I think that's probably one of the driving reasons for having written this essay. So I am going to do my best to summarize some of the key ingredients in this turn within modern sculpture as Penelope Curtis has laid them out. So we'll begin just as the author does with the influence of Rodin, whose approach to sculpture has deemed him the founder of the modern sculpture movement. Curtis states that Rodin departed so drastically from classical idealism of sculpture that he sort of swung the door wide open for modern sculpture, and maybe swung it so far open and his approach took it to such a dramatic degree that it, quote, paralyzed other artists who needed to find a way to stabilize the art form within this new era. These images of Rodin's Hand of God were not included in the article, but I want to just put them on the screen for us so we can look at them and illustrate the comparison that Curtis is making between artists. So Curtis says that in order to establish this stabilization of the formal qualities of the figure, many sculptures began to turn to the female form. And in that, we begin to see a very simplified version of this form physically, but an emphasis on, quote, the nuance of the internal. So the internal world and emotion in the piece. So Rodin's Hand of God, which is on the screen right now, was completed in 1907, which is the same year that the following slide was completed, or the artwork in the following slide was completed here. And here we have a portrait head in bronze by Dispute, in which we can definitely see evidence of that simplification in form, or of form, but also evidence and expression of this internal world, which begins to show this shift towards symbolism. Okay, so now let's look at Curtis's thoughts on archaism and the influence of classicism on modern works, which Curtis suggests is another of the stabilizing pillars of this movement. And I'll mostly focus on the work of Paul Manship for this example. Manship studied classical works, and he was very influenced by Roman and Renaissance bronzes. Here we see his bronze from 1923, the Greek goddess Diana, the goddess of animals and the hunt. So clearly in this, the classical narrative is a major influence, but it's very modern and simplified in its form and its expression. So we see the influence of classic works, but a very, very different physical expression for the sculpture. And I think looking at this piece is a really great piece to look at and ask ourselves the question, if we're seeing this classical narrative materialized in this very new and different form and expression, what does it tell us is really being expressed? What is the internal emotional world of the piece and of the artist? And just so we can take a moment to explore that, I want to zoom in a little bit closer on the piece so we can get a better look and maybe a better idea of what we think is being expressed, especially in all of this movement. I think this one in particularly is really, really stunning. Okay, so now we will explore with Curtis how we receive the emotional world of a sculpture through the idea of modest anonymity, another pillar of this essay and of the modern sculpture movement. And this section begins with a reference to the French author André Gide's comparison between Rodin's sculptures and Mayol's. Gide describes Rodin's sculptures as, quote, breathless, anxious, meaningful, and full of clamorous pathos. And he compares this description to Mayol's Woman and says of this piece that she, quote, doesn't signify a thing. She is a silent work of art. And Curtis asks in response to this whether Gide is claiming that Mayol's Woman is an absence of meaning, or if it is a withholding, an intentional withholding of meaning. She then references the work of Marino Marini, who is on the screen now, who she says through his works sought to strip his figures of historical pathos by employing a classical sense of anonymity. And I think these two sentences on the screen here are really key to understanding that Marini reference, so I would like to just read them straight from the essay. She writes, quote, Marino Marini often talked of his work as reticent and realistic, having a classical quality of anonymity. Marini looked to funerary busts of unknown Romans and to Etruscan funerary portraits as models for his own busts. He was interested in redefining the anonymous quality which made these ancient portraits human documents stripped of all historical pathos. I'm 2 seconds late with my next slide here. It would have been really cool if I got it right. But I think what is underlined is really significant. So I think considering the political landscape of this period and the influences that had on art, I think Curtis is suggesting this anonymity as a resistance to the politically influenced art of the early 20th century. Now, the illustration of this shift within this entire essay really starts to make itself evident in one of the final sections of the essay titled The Celebratory Body. And the author opens this section with these few sentences. Quote, it is understandable that a European generation which had become used to seeing disfigured soldiers might have wanted to see the image of the whole body in their monumental art, end quote. And she then introduces the work of Robert Tate Mackenzie. This is another image that was not included in the essay, but I wanted to pull it up and give a visual example of Mackenzie's work for the conversation. So in addition to being a sculptor, Mackenzie was also a physical education instructor. And throughout his career, he began collaborating with surgeons to reconstruct the bodies of soldiers who were wounded in World War I. And he ended up contributing and creating this new ideal of the human figure used in World War I memorials. And in the essay, Curtis suggests that Mackenzie's work in creating this contemporary ideal could have been a foreshadowing of the ideals pushed by the Nazi Party, who ended up drawing a lot of inspiration from works like these when creating their own monuments. And here is an example of one of those monuments. This is a bronze sculpture titled The Party, made by Arno Breker in 1940. Breker was a celebrated artist by the Nazi Party during this time because of his sculpture work. These works were heavily influenced by the idealism and the athleticism of classical Greek sculpture, and they portrayed how the Nazi Party defined their ideals. He was commissioned for a number of monuments during this time, most of which have been destroyed, including this one. And now we begin to see the effects of this symbolism in figures like these and in sculptures like these in the final section of the essay titled The Loss of the Ideal. And I want to pull Marini back up as a really incredible example of the loss of this ideal. And so we can visually compare works like Marini's to Breker's, which were made only a year apart, if that, depending on exactly when they were done. Marini's sculpture on the left was finished in 1939, and The Party on the right was finished in 1940. And I think what we can see here is that this was not just the artist's preference of figure and form, but preference in expression and symbolism and what the piece was saying to the viewer. Curtis refers to Marini in the conclusion of this essay. So I'd like to pull that up so we can read it together. She writes, "The uglifying of the body by Marini, Moore, etc. during the war and after must be seen as some kind of antidote to its earlier beautification." I have to practice the underlining. Recording is not as smooth as I would have liked it to be, but I'm working with what I have. Okay. The end of the war was not to restore Marini's faith. He likened his worldview to what some Romans felt in the last years of the empire, when they saw everything around them, a whole world order that had existed for centuries, swept away by the pressure of contemporary events. End quote. Nailed it. So, throughout the period of modern sculpture, we've seen this ideal form and this classical influence used and transformed in a number of ways and eventually reworked into this very intense use of symbolism, taking that figurative ideal from formal to symbolic. Thank you for going on this journey with me. I really appreciate your time and attention and look forward to hearing other people's interpretations and reading of this essay and all the essays that I missed out on when I chose this one. Have a great day.